Yes, okay, yes, people are in. I am only waiting for noon. Okay, someone else.
Yeah, sometimes when they come in, even like getting all the audio connection set up may take 1 or 2 minutes, 1 minute or so. So just maybe a minute will help. Rumina, are those all in?
Okay. They're all in, yes. I'm letting everybody in.
So let me just do a quick land acknowledgement and the intro, and then I will pass it to you.
Perfect, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, based on wherever you are. I am so happy to welcome you in this Indigenous Knowledge and the Academy SIG of Comparative International and Education Society is bi-monthly webinar. I am truly excited to have two amazing scholars who are going to cover Indigenous education in Taiwan and also in Russia. And this is very exciting because these regions that we have not covered much. I'm so happy to welcome them and also to hear from them, and also excited to see the Q&A session from all of you. And my name is Mong Neo. I am the co-chair of this Indigenous Knowledge and the Academy SIG, along with Rebecca Bayak. And I would like to start with the land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that this land on which I am now is at Harvard University, sits on the traditional territory of Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples, and the land on which I conducted research is the traditional territory of Marma, Chakma, Tripura, and other indigenous peoples of Chittagong Hill Tracts, Bangladesh. And these places have long been served as the meeting and exchanging, as place for meetings and exchanging ideas among nations. With that, I pass it to Romina.
Thank you very much, Mong. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Romina Quesala. I am the secretary of the Indigenous Knowledge in the Academy, Special Interest Group at CIES. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. I also acknowledge that the land on which I'm standing is the traditional territory of the Lenape people, Lenape Hoking. My institution is Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. And I encourage you all to write your acknowledgements on the chat if you would like to do so. And as Mom was saying, we have two guest speakers today. This is really, really exciting. The way this seminar, this webinar is going to take place is that we are going to, okay, I'm admitting someone else. This seminar, webinar, first of all, is being recorded. It's going live on Facebook right now, and we will be uploading this recording on YouTube later on. So just so you know, you're all aware of this. And the webinar takes about an hour and a half. We're going to give about 20 minutes to each of the guest speakers. And then we will open the floor to the Q&A part of the webinar. So if everything's okay, I'm going to start introducing the first speaker. And I am just going to open. Okay, so the first speaker that we have with us is Daria Khanolainen. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Daria has always worked in the field of education. Having graduated from Karelian State Pedagogical Academy in 2010, she went on to serve as a design teacher in a comprehensive school in Petrozavodsk, Russia. In 2015-2016, she took a master's degree in education management at King's College London. Upon her return to Russia, she assumed a role of a research associate at the Institute of Psychology and Education at Kazan Federal University. Since 2019, Daria has been a fully funded PhD student within the European Training Network, NEO-PRISM-C, at the University of Jyväskylä, Finland. In her current position, Daria is involved in a number of projects on learning difficulties, school bullying, and Indigenous education in Russia. Her current affiliations are she's a doctoral student at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland and a research associate at Kazan Federal University in Russia. And the topic of her webinar presentation is Indigenous Education in Russia, Opportunities for Healing and Revival of the Mari and Karelian Indigenous Groups, ? So please, Daria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I will start by sharing my presentation. Can you see my slides? Great. Then start from the beginning. But sometimes it's difficult for the slides to move on. So if that happens, then, well, we'll see. So yes, I'm Daria Khanolainen. I'm at the University of Jyväskylä at the moment. This is in Finland, so this is not indigenous land, but I have acknowledged in the chat that I was born on the indigenous land of Karelian people. And that's where we also conducted our research and collected data, but also in the Republic of Mariel, the indigenous land of Mari people. So I think I would start by just saying that we managed to publish an article on this data. So if you have more questions about this topic, if you would like to learn more about our methodology and all of the details, you can always find this article. It's published in open access, but if you have problems finding this article or you have questions about this research, then you can always get in touch with me and I would be happy to help you and answer your questions. But you can see all of the people who contributed to this research project. It was me and Yulia Nesterova, who is also here with us today, and Lena Semyonova. And I'm not sure if she is in the audience, but she is also an active member of this special interest group. So some of you might know her. So with that being said, let's just dive into the topic. We will be talking about Mariel, that is the Republic in the Russian Federation where Mari people live. And you can see in the map, the green part is Russia and the red part here is the Republic of Mariel. And all of, as you know, Russia is the biggest country in the world. So it has many different regions and some of them are called republics, and all of the regions that are called republics are actually homelands of indigenous people. So whenever you hear of any republic in Russia, you should know that it's an indigenous land. So this is Mariel, and you can see the distribution of of people living there. So the blue parts are where mostly Russians live. And overall, Russia is a very multicultural country. It has always been that way. But at the same time, 80% of all the Russian citizens are ethnically Russian. In English, we only have one word, Russian, but in the Russian language, it is actually two different words. You can be Russian by citizenship, Россиянин, but you can also be Russian by ethnicity, Русский, and those are two words in Russian. And here you can see that in this Republic of Mariel, the blue parts are where Russians mostly live and red parts where Mari people live. And you can see the percentages of people in this Republic. The latest statistic that we have is that in 2010, 45% of all the people in the Republic were Russian and about 42% were Mari. But the situation is quite different in Karelia. You can also see them on this map. They're right on the border with Finland. So Karelian language is very similar to Finnish language, and also Karelia and Finland share the same history and the same culture. But there is a border between them. And this is the map of the Republic of Karelia. The purple part here is where more than 50% of people are ethnically Karelian, but most of the Republic is Russian. So, and if you look at the distribution of different groups, you can see that in 2010, 82% of all the people were Russian and only 7% were Karelian. And the situation has been changing quite a lot throughout the years, throughout the Soviet period. You can see how it's been changing. In 1926, almost 40% were Karelian. But the numbers keep declining. So we will see why that might be happening. Why people, why the number of Russians is growing, and why the number of people who identify as Russians is growing, and the number of people who identify as indigenous is very low, but maybe something will happen in future and maybe some change. I mean, there are some reasons to hope that things might change. But also, before I go into reporting the results, I just wanted to say how we understand Indigenous learning and Indigenous education. So in this research, we mostly understood it as any learning, any education that is connected to Indigenous identities, Indigenous learning about Indigenous cultures, languages, and histories, anything related to Indigenous issues. Our main finding was that both groups reported that their Indigenous knowledge was very fragmented and unsystematic. And when they were children, their Indigenous learning was almost non-existent, and there was a difference between two groups. In Karelia, and Karelian participants said that they almost had no opportunity for Indigenous learning, while Mari people said that there were some opportunities, but we will talk about them a bit later. In this slide, we can see the quotes from Karelian participants, but also I kind of jumped into the quotes, but also let me just say we had 10 Karelian participants and 10 Mari people, and we tried to have a maximum variation sampling. So we try to ensure heterogeneity within our sample. So different ages, different occupations, different levels of education, different levels of involvement in Indigenous issues. So our sample was quite different, and we just wanted to capture the diversity of views. So 10 people in one group and 10 people in another group. So in regards to having opportunities for Indigenous learning, Karelian people mostly said they started by talking about having education at home, and they were saying that they were not learning anything related to their indigenous identity and their culture from their parents, from their families. Some of them only found out that they were Karelian or Mari later in their lives, so they were not brought up knowing that they were indigenous. And then people moved on and talked about their school education, their school years. And again, Karelians stressed that nothing was taught to them. Even though Karelia is the land of Karelian people, they practically learned nothing about Karelian people in their school education. Despite wanting to learn, some of them wanted to learn these things, but it wasn't there, that sort of opportunities. But then let's see at what Mari people was saying. Even though on the surface it seemed that they had some formal opportunities for learning at school, they were saying that it was more like a formality, and we can see this in this quote. For example, it might seem strange, but we didn't have a single lesson about the Mari culture at school. I'm not sure if it's okay to reveal this, but honestly, we had Mari lessons only on paper. I do have an A for the Mari culture in my high school diploma, but in reality, we had algebra during Mari lessons, and we were preparing for exams. And this is also something a few people reiterated and stressed, that Mari cultural learning was always sidelined, and people were focusing on something more important like algebra, because it gives you an opportunity in life. And why would you spend your time on something that is not going to provide any advancement in life? And another Mari person said we had a difficult situation at school because half of Mari's students did not speak the language at all. And for some reason, everybody hated our Mari teacher. It was just horrible, but probably everyone had something similar. Our Mari lessons were all a big mess. Nobody listened to anyone, and everybody was fighting with one another. You know what I mean? And then we started talking about why this situation was happening, why not much indigenous learning was happening in classrooms and at homes. And people shared some insights into historic oppression and how it affected their perception, and how it affected their parents, their grandparents, and how it affected them. And some of them said that they were growing up being ashamed of their ethnicity. And we can see both Karelian and Mari people were talking about this. We had a period when people were very ashamed of being Karelian. I was told that back then, under the Soviet regime, if you spoke Karelian, people viewed you as a peasant. Even if both parents were Karelian, they would only speak Russian so that their children would not learn any Karelian. That was done in order to prevent the oppression of children. One Karelian lady once told me that as children, they were punished if anyone heard them speak Karelian. So yeah, and this is also that we found in both groups who were saying that, being ashamed affected how they perceived education and what kind of educational needs they had. One Mari person said it was so uncool to be Mari. So our class group, made of predominantly Mari students, was very happy that we did not have to have any indigenous lessons. So they were very relieved, that we don't need to learn these things. We can just focus on math and other important issues. But that was the situation when people were growing up. But thankfully, the situation is changing, and people actually regret not having those opportunities when they were children, and not learning the language when they were children. not speaking that language with their families. And right now they feel like they're becoming interested in their roots. They want to identify as Indigenous at this stage, and you know, they are not ashamed anymore. A lot of them were saying that they are proud of who they are. And you can see in the quotes, I don't know the reason for this, but the older I get, the more I see that understanding this is becoming important to me, as well as knowing where I am, who I am, and who my ancestors were. And yeah, this is also people were talking about their hopes for future. So even though they didn't have opportunities when they were children themselves, they hope that maybe children in future will be able to have Indigenous learning, both at home and in schools. And you can see this is also an important quote. It's necessary. It is necessary to teach the Karelian language and culture at school, because it is so easy to lose this knowledge. Our elders are not passing down this knowledge. They survived the war, which makes them want to forget everything associated with that period. But children cannot just start learning on their own. They need to be encouraged and supported to learn this. So this is also something that people discuss, that if learning isn't happening at home, this is the responsibility of schools to tell people, you know, to share this knowledge, who Karelian and Mari people are. And another point that was made, that real opportunities need to be created, because at the moment both Karelian and Mari governments are doing you know, they're providing opportunities, but a lot of those opportunities are on paper. It looks like something is being done, but if you ask people, what do you think of this? They say it's not good enough. It's just a formality. It's just that the government is trying to look good, but it's just not good enough. And it is, so this participant said, it is important to give people real opportunities so that they could learn if they want to. It is not enough to create only one school for the entire city. There are 50 schools here, and he's talking about the capital of Karelia, Petrozavodsk, and only one offers Karelian language classes. Schools like that should open in every district. When the city library started offering Karelian language courses, the hall was packed. Not a single seat was left. People were prepared to stand in the corridor. I mean, there is so much enthusiasm that, but things are poorly organized. So he stressed that nobody should be forced to learn Karelian language, for example, but it would be great to provide those opportunities, because a lot of people actually want to learn the language, they want to learn more about the culture, but the opportunities that exist right now are just not good enough. And in conclusion, we'll just say that you know, there were a lot of similarities between two of those groups, but at the same time, even within the same country, different Indigenous groups might have very different educational opportunities. And we can see that Mari people had more opportunities to learn at home, maybe at school. Opportunities were not that great, but at least there was something, whereas in Karelia it was almost non-existent. Nobody ever mentioned Karelian culture and Karelian language at schools. So there is this difference. And well, yeah, I think that's the main message that I had. So hope things will be improving, and Karelian people are actually quite pessimistic about this whole situation. Mari people are more optimistic. So, but I hope that both groups will be able to revive their cultures and they will be able to speak their language proudly in their lands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria. It's a very deep study, and it really brings to the light what the feelings and the livings of the Mariel and the Karelian people. Very interesting. Thank you so much. So now we are going to listen to Yulia Nesterova. I am going to introduce her to you. Yulia Nesterova. Oh, please hold on. Yeah, I closed my window. Okay, there it goes. Yulia Nesterova, PhD, is a research fellow in education and international development at the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Her research interests include how inequalities and injustices are reproduced and how partnerships and local action can address and redress them. She is now working closely with partners in 10 countries across Africa and Asia to address these questions. Yulia has worked with Indigenous communities across the world, including Indigenous groups in Taiwan, for the past 7 years, focusing on their rights, education, and well-being. Prior to joining Glasgow, she was with UNESCO, working on peace building and sustainable development in Asia and the Pacific. And Yulia's topic for today is Indigenous education and development in Taiwan, challenges for transition from colonialism and authoritarianism to a just society. Welcome, Yulia, please.
Yes, thank you, Romina. Good day, everyone. I hope you can hear me well and you can see the presentation. I'm not really good with all these technological advances yet. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Yulia, yes.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. Yeah, good day to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I already included the acknowledgement of the land in the chat, but I want to kind of say it again, that acknowledge the land where I was born and grew up, that is Karelia, that Daria just talked to you about, and the land where I conducted my research, that is traditional land of 16 recognized and 10 unrecognized indigenous groups in Taiwan. So I'm going to talk to you about a study that is part of a much larger project that I conducted from 2015 to 2019. But it started much earlier than that. I started working with Indigenous communities in Taiwan specifically in 2013, and we were having these conversations about Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing and how to incorporate them into state-provided education in Taiwan, but also how to include families and the concept of intergenerational learning into schools that were dominated by non-Indigenous people. But we all shared these concerns about whether this space where all these things were supposed to be incorporated into, whether it was safe and responsive and epistemically just, if you wish. And then that's kind of how my research started. So one big part of this was to explore how structures and spaces should change and whether they can actually change to be genuinely inclusive, not in a tokenistic way, but genuine inclusion of really deep diversity and difference. And there were very interesting things happening in Taiwan at the same time. So there was a process of transitional historical justice, and there was this sort of trying to figure out what a just society means and how to transition to that from what has been colonial and authoritarian state for centuries before that. So if I figure out how to, okay. So what I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to briefly talk about Indigenous people and what challenges they face in Taiwan, what has already been done, and why some challenges remain. So when we talk about indigeneity in Taiwan, it basically refers to people who are called original peoples in Chinese, and they were recognized in Taiwan through constitutional amendments back in 1994, and they were given the special cultural rights. And then in 2015, when Indigenous Peoples Basic Law, which is basically a mini constitution in Taiwan, when it was revised, they received this status of legal entity in public law, which gave them more powers and more authorizations. Currently, there are 16 recognized indigenous groups. Unfortunately, on the map, you can only see 14 because it hasn't been updated since 2 more groups have been recognized, but there are 10 more groups that are called Pingpu that are seeking recognition, but unfortunately, government has rejected that a couple of times now. So why there are indigenous people? So we have Indicia developed by the UN and other organizations that defines who indigenous people are. And in Taiwan, what we can basically see is that they're very distinct culturally, ethnically, and linguistically from the dominant group that are Han Chinese. So they comprise 2.42% of the population belong to the Austronesian group. And through these waves of colonization and settlements that started in the 17th century with, of course, European colonization, they become politically, socially, and economically marginalized. So basically at this time, they have very limited control over any policies, laws, or any activities that are supposed to support them. And there is a Council of Indigenous Peoples that was established specifically to support their development. But unfortunately, what people I interviewed and I worked with over the years, what they say about this is that it's controlled by the government and it's heavily under-resourced in terms of finances, but also in terms of capacities. So there have been quite a few good developments in Taiwan since 1980s when the country started its transition to democracy. I already mentioned the basic law that was actually modeled after the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but there are also, laws to protect their employment rights, Name Act. In terms of education, there's a specific Education Act for Indigenous peoples. A few years ago, they introduced a Languages Development Act too, and there was this large multicultural reform for education. And I wrote an article about this last year, and I actually criticized that a lot. And I don't think that was very well done. And 2016 was this huge year when the president apologized for colonization and for cultural genocide, and basically promised this transitional justice period where they would address and redress all the inequalities and injustices. And this is when the Historical and Transitional Justice Committee was established. And the reason why I say here that it's a second period of transitional justice is that in 1987, 1989, when this democratic transition started, the ruling party at the time started this transitional justice period. They just didn't do anything for it. So what are the current challenges? Basically, as everywhere else with indigenous populations, we're talking about dispossession, destitution, marginalization. In terms of education, that's, issues with low academic achievement and high dropout rates for so many reasons, like, adjustment issues. Curriculum is not really sensitive to them. Pedagogists are very do not respond to traditional ways of being, knowing, and doing things, and so on. And then this all has led to so many different issues like low socioeconomic status, economic instability, huge dependency on welfare, poor health, with very high numbers of suicide, cancers, and addictions. In terms of cancers, many years ago, the government just dropped nuclear waste on one island that is heavily populated by indigenous communities without any consultation. So that has led to lots of cancers. And, there's lots of rural to urban migration, which compromises family structures, that makes rural communities very unsustainable. And as everywhere else with indigenous peoples, there's lots of loss of cultures and languages. So we can see that there have been all these changes. There's been introduction of all these different laws and policies and practices, but there has been little change. When we actually look at the literature in Taiwan, we have lots of literature that talks about, education being the problem, but from the perspective of curriculum and pedagogy being culturally insensitive, but also from this small macro level. A Taiwanese scholar, Tan, talks about, that Taiwan is a very immature democracy, all the structures are very top-down, and there's limited civil rights protection and so on. So I decided, as part of the larger project, to sort of explore all these challenges. And I've been working with 24 Indigenous leaders and experts over these years. And I specifically for this part, I did 3 rounds of interviews with them that started as semi-structured interviews and then just became, in the 3rd round, unstructured interviews, where we were talking about, all what should be done instead and how it should be done and so on. So I did critical discourse analysis of policies and laws available, but I'm not going to talk about it today, because I just want to center the voices of all these Indigenous participants. But I just want to say that these are people who are actually, experts and leaders, both in their communities, but also in the Indigenous movement in Taiwan. And they have loads of work experience, both for Indigenous organizations or universities, but also with the government, and specifically for Indigenous movement. So we identified 4 challenges, and while I sort of separated them into 4, they are all interrelated and interconnected, and you'll see that later. So it was sort of very difficult to separate, but we decided to go with these 4 aspects. So let's talk about policies and laws. So when we actually look at all the processes that have been happening in the past 30 years since the end of martial law in Taiwan, we can see that there has been this shift in state-indigenous relationships. So from the positive perspective, the laws were modeled after UNDRIP, so they're seen as very empowering and progressive, although they sort of lost their teeth in the process of, adoption and implementation. They do outline, protect, and defend Indigenous rights. And some participants actually said that the government is trying and it has good intentions. But then the issues are that some participants said, like, you see all these policies, but when you actually start, on the surface, they seem very empowering. But when you actually start reading them and start kind of just comparing them to Indigenous values, you see that there is nothing from Indigenous peoples there. And they sort of have become this icon that represents progress, but in actuality, it doesn't work at all. So they're basically talking about these policies as, being, another wave of social welfare from the government, and not including any perspectives from Indigenous people. And, the government actually doing all of, this sort of disservice to indigeneity, because they see Indigenous people as a burden that is just a minority that should be placated with very little. And, as in many places with minority population, we talked a lot about affirmative action and how good it is for Indigenous communities, but they refer to it as special treatment. And what they said, and I thought that this quote was really powerful, because this person basically said that, we have just basically become these people who receive welfare, and because they just give us these crumbs here and there, we are supposed to be submissive. We're not supposed to voice out our concern or to trouble the government in any way. So they just, give us little to placate us, but they don't treat us as equal human beings. And I think it was so powerful, because there are all these, sort of issues raised about, voice and ownership and equity between different groups, but also respect for dignity and differing perspectives, and actually acknowledging history, because Indigenous people are not asking for something extra. They're not asking for pity. They're asking to acknowledge that history happened, and that it, like, all the legacy, needs to be redressed. But we shouldn't just be negative about this. And they talked about this being a great start, because it did initiate action, and it started a conversation at different levels in Taiwan. And, we have, for example, comparatively high representation of Indigenous individuals in politics and decision making. And it was interesting for me to see this that, you know, a wider Indigenous community, even in rural areas, in remote areas that may not be, you know, formally educated at all, but there is this high awareness of their rights. And if something happens, they know how to advocate, you know, against a particular business or enterprise or government when they try to violate their rights, for example. Another issue is implementation. So what they were talking about is, well, supposedly these rights, all these policies and laws are great, but they are only on paper and they haven't been translated into action. And where they have been sort of, you know, implemented, all this implementation has been so mishandled. There is no point in those at all. And another research by another Taiwanese academic basically said that some of these policies have done more harm than good. And then when we talked about why this mishandled implementation actually happens, so they talk about quite a few things. So lack of commitment is a huge one, because Indigenous people are a minority, and it's 2.4%. So their needs and struggles and concerns are not really seen as very serious or urgent, because, you know, there is a larger population of people with their own concern. Again, you know, implementation is not really funded that well, and especially, you know, going back to Council of Indigenous Peoples, it is underfunded, it is under-resourced, both financially and in terms of, you know, people who have expertise to support implementation. And another issue is in terms of the, you know, social and political climate and who supports implementation or investment into Indigenous development. And the thing that they talked about is, you know, who's actually in charge of decision making and implementation. And they talk about the individual agency, because, well, overall climate in Taiwan is not particularly, you know, conducive to all these changes, but it's up to the people, individual people, and their professionalism, their cultural sensitivity, and whether they want to push for change at all. But they also talk about this dominant framework within which all these changes are supposed to take place. And they say that, you know, non-Indigenous people, they just refuse to accept this, you know, this new Indigenous laws or policies, because the concept they draw upon when they need to make decisions on anything, they're inherited from this history of colonialism that is so ingrained in the society. Another issue is with party politics, and basically when they said that they don't trust any party officials and the public, and it includes both Chinese and Indigenous people. In terms of Chinese politicians, they say they just don't have any faith in them. So they're really worried about, you know, transitional historical justice commission at this point, because they don't believe that anything is going to happen afterwards. It's just going to be another, you know, series of papers published. But also when they talk about, you know, Indigenous politicians, they just say that they've become these submissive people who just follow the government and don't question it at all. So, and then they talked about this fight between the two parties. I'm sorry, I didn't really give a very good context for that, but Taiwan has basically two main parties, which is Kuomintang, Chinese Nationalist Party, and DPP, which is Democratic Progressive Party, that is in charge right now. KMT was a party that established martial law, and that was the first party to transition the country from authoritarianism to democracy. And their fight is affecting Indigenous people very much. And one participant basically said that they were really surprised that anything actually happened, because it seems that nothing ever works for Indigenous people, because there is no environment for that. You know, the political climate is not really conducive for that. And they talked about, all of them talked about, neither of these parties has their interests at heart or can act actually sincerely, you know, working with Indigenous people, trying to understand what their issues actually are and how they can benefit Indigenous communities. There is this sort of intergenerational divide, and we can talk about this. I just want to in more detail, but I want to mention just a few things. So KMT, this Chinese Nationalist Party, is very much supported by older generation, and they've been there since 1940s. So there is a sense of familiarity, and they've been providing social welfare and subsidies. And one of the participants said survival is the most important issue for Indigenous people. And that is, of course, that is a huge issue because indigenous communities they live in terrible poverty. And KMT actually offers them the social welfare, whereas DPP talks a lot about policies and identity, and policy is very far away from the reality on the ground. So of course there is more support from the older generation, whereas younger generation just thinks that KMT is playing with the older population. They're just abusing them to build their own legitimacy and get more votes. And they think that all this provision of welfare within this dominant society is not working for them. And they basically refer to status quo as humiliating and even degrading. So DPP is seen as less harmful because they do make sort of more effort to support indigenous communities, but still they said, it's all pretty words and pretty ideas. And when it comes to action and implementation, DPP officers also become very passive. And the huge issue that basically underlines all of the previous challenges is historical legacy. So we here talk about both colonial and nationalist legacy, and in terms of mindset. And they talked a lot about non-indigenous people, but they talk about internalized colonialism of indigenous people being a huge stumbling block to indigenous development and their opportunity to change anything in the education system. So when we talk about historical legacy, because Taiwan went through waves of colonization, starting with quite a few European powers and going to Chinese settlers, but the main one was Japanese colonialism that started in 1895 and ended in the 1940s, that basically established this colonial structure, which with very strong and violent assimilationist policies and very imbalanced power relationships. And when KMT came to power in 1940s, and they sort of inherited that structure and they just built upon it. So nothing has been changed. They just added a few of their own sort of aspects of their own tradition of dealing with minority populations. But for indigenous people, it's basically these two systems were the systems of occupation, domination, and violent assimilation. So there are lots of different manifestations of this historical legacy at this point. The terribly negative attitudes towards indigenous people. They are seen as only good for manual labor or for as a tourist attraction. So there's lots of issues with, this indigenous authenticity at this point. There's lots of discrimination, poor treatment, abuse of their rights and well-being, as I mentioned before, in terms of nuclear waste on the island of Lanyu. There is this continued enforcement of non-indigenous norms, values, and power. So they find it really hard to find space to actually revitalize their own and strengthen their own communities and their own power and values and knowledges. And there's also this the historical legacy. It continues to influence the political climate and decision making. Again, we talked about policies and laws and why they're not adopted or why they are adopted and how they're implemented or whether they are implemented at all, and who actually determines who has a voice that is heard and acknowledged. And just internalized colonialism, sorry, I almost forgot about that. So that was really huge conversation that we had in terms of, many indigenous people disregard their own indigeneity and just, follow the dominant construction of the world. And it was really interesting for me to sort of see this reference to Frantz Fanon's black skin, white mask from the participants. Quite a few of them talked about this. When they basically said, indigenous people, they're not interested in their own languages, cultures, and histories anymore. They don't want to talk about this very problematic history that continues to influence every aspect of their life. They just, they don't want to speak for their people, they don't want to fight for them. They just, they become well educated, they're accepted by the government. They just want to become similar to those people and just, get that power over their own communities without supporting them in any way. So just to conclude, yes, we can see that there are some very powerful laws and policies. There's been some changes in the country, but as the participants talked about them, they just said that it's just a show to ensure that people are not angry. So it's all about placating them, so they don't speak against the government. And this persistence of the issues Indigenous peoples are struggling with is the result of this multitude of interrelated challenges. And that includes the lack of control, authority, representation, knowledge, and values in anything related to their development or education that they have, but also disinterest in and misunderstanding of what Indigenous people are actually facing by the wider society. And this perpetuation of the colonial mentality, and that's having an impact on the society, and doesn't allow to actually change any structures or create the space where Indigenous people could work on addressing and redressing any issues that they've been struggling with. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulia. Thank you so much. Probably your topic resonated within so many realities among the people that are watching us on Facebook and the people that are here. I think many links can be drawn from your presentation. And so before we move on to the Q&A part of the webinar, I just wanted to point out that we posted the link to the paper that Daria just discussed. It's on the chat. And if you do not have access to the chat, it has the same title, Indigenous Education in Russia, Opportunities for Healing and Revival of the Mari and Karelian Indigenous Groups. It is on Compare, a journal of comparative and international education. It's on tandonline.com, Taylor and Francis, published on October 20th this year, if you ever want to continue reading about this research. And so now we can move on to the Q&A section. We already have a question on the chat. You can either raise your hand or you can write your question on the chat, and we will go that way for now. Okay, so I will start with the first question that says, Myanmar is organized by 135 ethnic groups and is facing civil war. Most Indigenous students encounter language barriers in school. For the government, what is the best approach to create a school curriculum for all of these 135 ethnic groups? And do we want, maybe perhaps we're gonna accept a couple of questions and then think of that. So maybe I see Mong raised his hand. Mong, do you wanna?
Sure. Thank you, Romina, and also thank you, Daria, Yulia. I know you before, but I think that now it is wonderful to hear all the work that, some of a glimpse of the work that you have done. So these are very important work. And I have a question that may be also connected to both. So first question is it is terrible, but it is not surprising, that not shocking. That means that the situations that Indigenous people face in different parts of the world are so strikingly similar. Disposition from the land, destruction of their homes, loss of a language, and also the implication of it, historical trauma. You mentioned about suicide rate and all of this. So that is, and also being, Daria mentioned that feeling ashamed. So towards the end, Daria, you mentioned is that there are some changes. So they are not ashamed anymore, or something that is better than before. And my question is, what has changed? What contributed to that hope? Is it as a local level? That means that something that community has done, or is it at a policy level that government has changed policy? So what contributed to the change of the perspective? I have a question for Yulia, but I will wait until Daria answers it. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a very good question. And yeah, we can say that after the Soviet Union collapsed, the country started this process of democratization. But of course, Russia is very far from being a democratic country, and the government wants to look democratic. So sometimes they provide some opportunities, but mostly all of the work that is being done is by communities themselves. Of course, in Karelia, the number of Karelian people is very small. So the work that is being done is different in terms of its scale and impact compared to Mariel. And in Mariel, there are many more initiatives and different projects to get people involved in education and language learning. But me being from Karelia, I know Karelian context better. And I can see that the government sometimes, in one of the quotes was that the city library was offering Karelian language course. That was organized by the government, but not much resources went into that, and it was the course wasn't long enough to build any proficiency in that language. So it was it was an opportunity, but it wasn't well funded. It wasn't not much resources went into that. So government is doing as little as possible to still appear as well-meaning and to still appear as if, we're helping and we're trying to revive the culture. But I think most of the work is done by communities themselves. So yeah, but since the number of Karelian people is so small in Karelia, so that's why I think they're more pessimistic, that there are not enough people to conduct, to initiate more projects.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you so much. Yulia, would you like to address the question in Myanmar?
Oh, goodness. That's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, because both in Russia, I come from Karelia. My grandmother was one. I grew up in a very, ethnically, religiously diverse family, and have lived in very diverse contexts trying to actually figure out how to do this. And I don't really know, but, Russia is a hugely diverse society, but it's sort of easier in a way when you think about all the land and the republics. And it's very sort of easy in terms of, establishing own schools, for example. But, Myanmar is a small country compared to that. And in Taiwan, we've been talking a lot about this, because, the recognized groups, there are 16, but they have 42 languages. So how do you actually develop? And even, the government gives lots of money for language revitalization, but which language are we talking about, for schools, for example? I honestly, I think that in the context of Indigenous people, it's a huge challenge to talk about, policy borrowing or borrowing of best practices, for example. I guess the way forward, and Daria, Elena, and I talked about this. We're going to publish another article, and it's just, I think it's all, it goes back to just community ownership and, giving space to make decision what a particular Indigenous group or ethnic group is going to do in terms of their formal education and non-formal spaces. So if they want to study in a particular language, it has to be provided. If they can't ensure that at the formal level, there are always, opportunities to do it at non-formal level. So in this way, probably we can actually learn from other countries. And I think I'm probably just going to lie right now, but I think Cambodia has done quite well in terms of language revitalization. I think it should be checked. That's what I remember from UNESCO, at least. That's not the topic I was working on, but I've heard from quite a few people there. I'm sorry, I don't feel like I'm answering the question, but I feel that, the only way is community ownership and just having a very strong voice that is listened to and acknowledged and pushed by, different levels of, society, starting with grassroots and, going back to the top.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think you did answer to the question. It was a difficult one, but we definitely see an answer there. Thank you so much. Mong, would you like to continue with the second part of your question?
Sure. I think that both Daria and Yulia's case, you mentioned also is that there are superficial change, there are cosmetic change, right? And whatever is about indigenous community challenges faced, often the tendency from the government or policymaker is to sanitize it, is to deodorize it, and then present it more palatable way to the world. And if you think of the indigenous community in each of those countries, whether it's in Taiwan or whether it's in Russia, the indigenous communities have been silenced in the past. And even though they're given some rights, it is limited. So there is a power differential. It is that the majority doesn't provide or not much willing to support the education of the children in the indigenous communities. When we think of all means all, that means that all children, not just majority children, right? Children from any house, any community, a child is a child. The challenge I see in this and many contexts, and I would love to hear from you, is that while the people who have the power are not willing to accommodate based on the international law, like UN rights, not necessarily law, but rights of indigenous peoples, what can indigenous community do? Where do you see the sources of hope? Not only just creating the hope, but sustaining the hope. And that can be also how, say, indigenous communities in other parts of the world can come together or work or support each other. As you were saying, Yulia, is that we can learn or we can connect. So do you have some concrete examples, or do you have some good suggestions for indigenous communities in other places who face the similar challenges, that the dominant group makes a lip service and provides superficial support, but really doesn't make grassroots change, and this power structure continues? So thank you.
Yeah, I think I will start answering this question. Well, yeah, I completely agree. You nicely summarized very important points. And it is indeed the case that, government wants to look good and they blame everything that is bad on the indigenous people. If people are not learning about their culture, if people are not speaking their language, it's because they don't want to do it, and it's their families who are not passing down the knowledge. So why? And we as a government, we're doing our best. So basically that's the narrative that we see. But at the same time, if we look who is in the government, Karelia doesn't have Karelian people in the government, and even if there are some of them, they never identify themselves as Karelian. So it's difficult to know if anyone is Karelian. Everyone is presenting as Russian. And if we look at the people, the governors who were put at the very top of both republics, they do not come from indigenous communities. So it's the current governor is Russian. The previous one was ethnically Finnish, but he was identifying as Russian. So I don't even remember anyone in local governments who come from indigenous communities, and I think that would make that would start making a difference if if indigenous people enter the government and if they participate in policy making. But it is difficult to see if that is even possible, because governors are not elected. So even if people in republics decide that, okay, we would want to elect our representative, it's not even possible. Governors are appointed by the federal government, and the federal government, of course, wants all of the governors to be Russian. It's just easier to organize things this way. And they just want people who would governors who would just agree with the federal government and never challenge them and never ask for too much, asking for things they don't want to be asked for. And maybe a way forward would be just a general democratization of the country, because that would ensure that people would start electing who they want. They would start electing their representatives, and those people would speak on behalf of indigenous people, and that would create this this chain reaction, and then we would start seeing more and more indigenous initiatives and projects and language revitalization and things like that. Of course, it would be nice to have bilingual schools, for example, but again, people on the ground and indigenous people saying it's not realistic. We don't have people who could teach, we don't have bilingual teachers. Of course, we want that, but how can we have it? It's just not realistic at this point. But I think so. It would be a very, very difficult and long process to go to a democratic society, but probably at some stage it will be possible. I hope that it doesn't happen too late, because Karelian people are already quite pessimistic that it might be too late already.
Yeah, following on that, I just think, Taiwan is obviously not the best example, but it's a very good example of how democratization can actually help. And I think the reason why Taiwan has managed to sort of emerge from this centuries of colonization and decades of authoritarian regime was civil society that was pushing for reforms. And that was both indigenous communities, but also Chinese Taiwanese people who were very strongly pushing for changes. I think in terms of this sort of very good example of how a society can change to accommodate is probably not the right word, but to include, that's probably not the right word either. So to indigenize in a way, I think New Zealand would be a good example, although I'm sure Maori people would strongly disagree with me, but I think that's a good example in a way of, how to sort of acknowledge the history and how to start moving forward. And I wanted to say Canada too, but it's in so many studies now that, well, they did have a reconciliation commission, but, a settler teachers, they just so scared to teach indigenous history and what was actually happening in residential schools and with appropriation of land and so on. So I have been thinking about this now that I'm writing a book based on my PhD research, And I just feel that, you know, all these sort of actions taking in different countries to support Indigenous communities, they are all sort of based on this idea of either empathy or, well, they're so underdeveloped, we need to do something about that because our country is sort of developed, instead of just, you know, just going back to one of the quotes of my participants, you did that. Because of you, this group is underdeveloped. It's not because they don't have knowledge or capacities or skills or they're, you know, illiterate. It's because you did that, or not you or your ancestors, but you are sort of benefiting from this system and they are not. So you need to acknowledge that history. You need to acknowledge the fact that it's impacting these communities right now, and all the changes need to kind of start with this. So we acknowledge that it happened. We acknowledge that it's impacting the communities right now. Now we need to create change, and we need to create change based on what they see as problem, how they identify them, how they define them. So it sort of starts with acknowledgement and also giving ownership to people we will not probably agree. And, you know, well, that's not really my place, but in, you know, giving suggestions in Taiwan, for example, because I'm not from there, I'm not Indigenous Taiwanese, I'm not even, you know, a citizen of Taiwan. But if it doesn't start with Indigenous communities there, and if it's not them who make this decision and voice their concerns, or just, you know, tell their civil society or government or whoever what they want to do, this is just useless changes. And, you know, when we actually look at the 30 years of democratization in the country, nothing really changed that much because the structures are really the same. Just because you add a language lesson of 45 minutes is not going to revitalize the language, and it's not going to help people at all. And they may not really need that. They may need, you know, some other things to support their communities. I feel like I'm just becoming really, you know, impassioned.
Thank you.
About this.
Yes.
I have a quick question. Just going back to, I always want to ask anybody who comes to our webinars to make sure that how do you gain access? Because I feel like it's really important for people, and it's good that, you know, Yulia, you're not from Taiwan, and so how did you gain access, right, to study, and what are the challenges, and how did you position yourself? The same goes to you, Daria. And then the second question I would love to ask you both, and specifically Daria, is that how are the Kenyan people preserving their own heritage or history? Like, let's leave out the government. No, but how are they locally? Is it happening within the family? And I heard you, Yulia, saying that your grandmother or something was a Kenyan. So how is that history preserved so that it's passed down from generation to generation? Because for now, as you both said, like, you know, you can't count on the government. So it has to come from the people themselves, right? You have to come from the people themselves. So how do you ensure that how do these communities make sure that, you know, their culture is passed down? How are they living out that? So I will leave it for there. I saw Shu who wants to ask a question, so let me just.
So I probably will start by answering the first question about access. So because I was born in Karelia, I know a lot of people there, so it was for me, that part of the research wasn't difficult, but Elena Simonova, she is from Mariel, so she is a Marie person, and she was responsible for that part of our research. So being Marie person herself, she found people, and it was a snowball sort of strategy on her part. But me and Yulia, we're both from Karelia, and we also used social media to find people, because Karelian people are quite active on social media, and there are they have different unions and different groups on social media. So that's we reached out to them, finding some of the biggest groups that they have on social media, and we advertised our research project there, and a lot of people reached out saying that this is quite interesting, and we would like to see what this project is about. And at the same time, we did the same for Marie people. There were some discussion on social media, but they didn't volunteer to participate, and that's why Elena had to use this snowball strategy, and she had to go to the Republic herself and start finding people herself, because people on social media, for some reason, they were a bit skeptical about this project, and things like that happen. But once you start talking to people face to face and you explain what is your project about, what is your intention behind your project, it's people open up to you, and they start talking. And obviously it was easier to split the work, with Elena being Marie and talking to Marie people, and for me it was easier to talk to Karelian people, even though I'm not ethnically Karelian. I am Finnish, Ingrian Finnish, but Ingrian Finnish and Karelian people have always lived together, and people would hear my last name and they would immediately ask me, "Are you Finnish?" And as I already mentioned in my presentation, Finnish, Ingrian Finnish, and Karelian people, also Vepsian people, they all lived together and shared the same history, shared very similar cultures and languages. I see Karelian people as brotherly group of people, and they see, Finns as brotherly group of people. So there is this connection on that level. That was helping me. And when people would refer to some important cultural landmarks or things like that, I would immediately understand what they. And if I wouldn't be someone who was born in Karelia, it would be difficult for me to understand what they're talking about. But having that local knowledge was helping me conduct that research and to connect with people who were sharing their views. So that is in regard to access. And the second question about how people are preserving their culture. So there is this, and again, I will mostly focus on Karelia because this is where I was collecting data. And people saying that it's not happening that smoothly. So in the family, again, you would assume, so if you have Karelian parents, they would tell you who Karelian people are, they would share the language with you, but many families don't have that. And because some of the elders, Karelian elders, endured oppression, and they went through very traumatizing experiences, they feel like they associate that trauma with their culture and with their language, and they feel like I survived that, but I'm doing okay by being Russian. So they kind of transitioned into becoming Russian, and they want their children to also to be Russian, because that means that children will avoid similar traumatizing experiences. And so that's why education at home doesn't happen. So some families, of course, do keep their traditions that way, but it's not common. And actually, there is a difference between cities and villages. So in the villages where sort of indigenous communities were sidelined to live there, and they have more density. And if you're Karelian and your neighbors are Karelian, obviously you relate to each other. Your children go to the same school, and you can be openly Karelian. And so they kind of, being those sort of small pockets of Karelian communities, they keep their language that way, their culture that way. But in cities, all of the participants from cities was saying that they were the only Karelian family in their neighborhood. So, and this is something they didn't want to talk about to anyone. And even if you are not ashamed of this, you're just sort of, you don't it's not a cool topic to discuss, and you kind of sort of, you just want to fit in. You see that your neighbors are Russian and you become also Russian. It's just, it sort of becomes easier that way. When everyone is Russian, it makes things easier if you present as Russian yourself. And yeah, so I guess for people in the cities, the process is of keeping culture is quite difficult. So that's why I think in the cities, especially, it is important to establish schools who would do this work, and if it's understandable if people went through traumatic experiences and they don't want to be teaching their children about Karelian people, then the responsibility is on the schools.
Great, thank you so much, Daria. Like I said at the beginning, the impression that this paper gives me is that it's so heartfelt. So yes, you can see that. I don't know if somebody else has any questions here. Does anybody want to raise their hands or write something on the chat? For those who just recently joined us, I'm going to post again the paper that Daria is referring to. There it is, if you want to refer to it later on. If not, I would like to ask a question. So somebody, anybody? Okay, so I'll go with my question. And this is because of following up on Rebecca's question and your answer. I feel, I'm not sure, but it looks like in the process of data collection of the Mari and Karelian paper, Karelian people were more responsive through social media than Mari people. However, Mari people are more optimistic about the future than Karelian people. So that is really interesting. I am not sure if you noticed that or if you discussed it, but I would really like to hear your thoughts before saying anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, we noticed that, but it's kind of hard to say why. When we were reading the comments from Mari people, they were mentioning that they didn't like the fact that they were referred as minority. And in Karelia, Karelian people are obviously a minority. It's only 7% of the population. But in Mari, they're about 42%. Obviously, the number of Russians is bigger than Mari, but they still didn't like the fact that people are referring to them as an ethnic minority, and they see themselves as the rightful dominant group in their land, and being referred as a minority was offensive. So sort of this our message in the group, in the social media, sort of was I don't know whether it was seen as offensive, but there was some discussion, that it's a bit strange that we were referring to us as a minority, and maybe that put off some people. So I don't know why Karelian people were so open on social media. It seems like Karelia is very much into, developing their presence on social media, and there are multiple groups who are very active. So I don't know why that is, but it is an interesting observation.
Thank you. Yes, very interesting. It gives a little hope. So very, very interesting. Are there any other questions, any comments, any?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment to what Daria said, right? So the issue of access, gaining access, and is really interesting because when you design, let's say, your proposal, or you submit your protocol for research to your IRB institution, like the institution here in the US that supervise, gives you right to conduct human, protected human research, human protected research or something. So they always want to have you to design, right? To kind of say what you're going to do. But what happens, that I think that's a discussion that needs to be, that needs to happen broadly to make sure that you understand that depending on the context and the people, your research approach or the way you collect data, the way you reach out to the participant will definitely be different. And mostly because you're dealing with people, indigenous people, you're dealing with people who have a different culture, who have different ways of approaching things. One thing I did not say, so thank you for sharing that you use one method, one way to gain access, social media. The other was like, hey, we don't trust, no, you have to come here in person. So one thing I did not hear was from Yulia. So how did you, being from, not being a Taiwanese, gaining access to the Taiwanese, to that community? How was it? How did you make that happen?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. That was an interesting sort of coincidence. I was I was working in Brazil at the time, and then I was invited to work on this project in Taiwan. And I didn't know that I would be working with indigenous communities, and I was shocked and very unpleasantly surprised, let's put it this way, because it was sort of called as, referred to as a very progressive organization, but it just ended up being a very sort of similar approach to just assimilating indigenous communities in the end. And I started, I just met lots of different indigenous people through that project and got invited to all these different events. So basically, for 7 years, being in their communities and spending all the time there and just trying to create change where possible in the organization, so that it would become more accommodating in a way. But it just didn't work, and I just left. But we had lots of all these different discussions about education and development of Taiwan at the time. And one of my friends there, who's indigenous Paiwan, and her husband is Puyuma, so he's the leader of their community. And she told me, like, why don't you just do a PhD on that? So we're talking about me applying for a PhD program. And I felt really uncomfortable because I had been working, and I had some professors before that who are indigenous from different parts of the world, and I felt really uncomfortable doing any research on anything but Karelian, because that's what I knew, but that's what I was really traumatized to even talk about at the time. But then I started talking with lots of different people, and they just they had very different approach to how Maori people or First Nations in Canada, for example, work with different non-Indigenous people from their context. So we developed a proposal together, applied for a PhD, and we worked throughout my PhD together. I formed an advisory board with Indigenous people who went through everything, all the writing, all the assumptions, arguments, and so on. So basically, I was very privileged to just be given access to people I interviewed. But so what I did sort of to protect people was to just work with those who are already in position of power in a way. So it was professors, it was Indigenous leaders leading organizations or working for Council of Indigenous Peoples, for example, or principals of schools and so on. So yeah, so it's basically it was this process of many years of building relationship and just being invited and by Indigenous people themselves.
Thank you for sharing that. Thanks.
If I may just add one point, and this is more of a observation wise, it is that following up Rebecca's question and your answer, I think this is a very important one. the fact that Yulia, you come from an indigenous community yourself, and then you had the opportunity to conduct research in another indigenous community. Daria, also, you mentioned where you start and also the communities that you studied. Often what happens is that indigenous communities live within certain hierarchical power structures, and they can say to some extent how much they can say. But you coming in as an outsider, but you had the fresh eye to see what is going on, but also you are not necessarily, say, responsible or under the control of those governments. And so because of your academic freedom or wherever you are from, you are going back to those places, but then you can still talk about what you observe and what you have seen and what you found in your studies. Even local indigenous people who know what is going on, they often cannot speak the way that, say, as someone from outside can share, because they often fear reprisals. So I think here is the huge value added that someone from other communities can come in and in a way lift the voices of those people, and still acknowledging that your positionality and then your limitation as an outsider, right? So I think that is something that we can do a lot, because often even within the country, the majority communities do not study indigenous communities' work and how the way that we try to bring out authentic stories. So I also see as a second benefit of this is that we cannot rely on government to solve our problems. However, we can build bridges among indigenous communities all over the world, and then we can even conduct studies and research going to other indigenous communities, and then also help those community voices lifted up. I think these two are a big contribution the way that you have done and shown through your good examples. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Among Yulia, Daria. We are getting close to, or we're just about to, here we are, the end of our webinar. So I just finished the streaming, but those who did not make it to make any questions or anything, please feel free to stay with us if you want after this. So before that, I just would like to thank again Yulia, Nesterova, and Daria Khanolainen for being here, and everybody else. And we hope to see you again in our next webinar.